conflict in and of itself isn't scary. It's mismanaged conflict that's very scary.
Welcome to the TroopHR Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. A recent study by the Conference Board revealed that 60% of corporate executives say today's political environment is more challenging to navigate than it was 4 years ago. With many companies implementing bans on political discourse in the workplace, it raises a key question. When it comes to sharing political and social views at work, where do you stand? Is it yes, we can, or ban DEI? Or is it something in between? Today, we're not diving into political positions, but instead exploring a timeless framework for navigating the diverse mosaic of views that reflects the complexities of our workforces and our role as leaders in managing it. To help unpack this, I'm joined by HR veteran Jen Fox, founder of OrgSavvy, and conflict resolution expert Pete Turok, founder of Curie. We'll be starting on a positive note by asking, what are the hallmarks of an organization that successfully manages the web of contrasting personal views and beliefs in the workplace?
Oh my goodness. Hallmarks of an organization that is doing well with this, right? People feel like they belong. I think you're going to see indicators of less turnout, less explosive conflict. I tend to think of organizations like this that are really good at handling micro conflict, because conflict's inevitable, right? It's just a part of work, part of our personal lives. It's everywhere. And I think it's really about how cultures, how families, how people handle conflict. And I describe it as climbing the mountain, right? There's going to be micro conflict when you and your friends climb a mountain. Who's going to navigate? Who's going to carry the water, which is always the heaviest, right? But once you're standing on top of that mountain, it's a feeling like no other. And the next thought on everyone's mind is, what mountain are we going to climb now? What's next? And that's resilience. And so those cultures that are positioned well, I think, are going to be able to weather the storm. And it comes through people being able to be straight in their communication with each other, but also have a good skill set that allows for understanding, for people to be heard, for everyone to be responsible for their own biases. There are skills involved in that, but in the end, it's worth it.
What comes to mind right now as a hallmark as an organization is a willingness to be honest that everything's not okay. I think one of the biggest flags to me is when clients in my HR sort of consulting capacity, when they talk about the culture as being so nice and so family focused and all of that. And when I think about these times, and a lot of sort of building on what Pete has just said, conflict is inevitable. And if you're willing right now to say, we are in it, it might not be like everybody's overtly fighting and arguing, but acknowledging that in these times, with 5 generations in the workplace, with diverse working environments, remote, hybrid, everybody's everywhere, and then you layer on a political firestorm that you really can't get away from. If you're saying everything's okay, you're probably not telling the truth. So I guess honesty and a willingness to say this is messy right now would be the first hallmark that I would point to.
What I really found interesting to bring both your answers together is the organizations that are being proactive with developing this culture are likely, Pete, to your point, better positioned to weather the storm. That in itself is creating, Jen, an environment where people feel that they can be honest. And of course, it could be about these different topics that we're going to dive into today. But you would also, I would imagine, if you were looking at this from a cynical business standpoint, you want people that are going to work for you to tell you the honest answers when it comes to making business decisions too. So there's a vested interest in creating a culture where folks feel safe to be honest. One of the things that I've noticed over the past few years is that we, in the late teens and then early 2020, I suppose prior to the pandemic, were very focused on creating an environment where people could bring them whole selves to work.
Mm.
And starting to break down this barrier of the moment you cross the threshold of the office, you're no longer a person, you're a professional, and you can't talk about your personal life. And that worked well. And then I felt like we hit this inflection point where there began to be backlash of, hey, actually, I don't want to hear the full part of your journey or how your views on things because they're conflicting with mine. What do you feel led to that inflection point where the backlash started to kick in? What are some of the contributions to that?
Mm.
Oh, you're hitting a hot button topic for me. Um, I think that what happened was, and I do think it was propelled, accelerated by the pandemic, right? If we can place ourselves back into that spring of 2020, every single call started with, if not ended up being completely derailed into, how are you? How are we doing? It was just like, it was the softer side of everything. And I think we over indexed on that. I think companies started to succumb to the pressure of this bring your whole self to work. It sounded great. It looks great on the website, attracting candidates. ERGs, right? DEI initiatives started to pop up. Bring your whole self. We welcome everything. Let's not even talk about the social media campaigns that people just put out there to check the box. So what happened then? Why, to your question of why did that start to shift? Because the workforce has become educated and smart that they're not just going to be okay with the talking point on the website. Okay, you want my whole self? Show me the policies and the support to back it up. I speak often, I'm a mom of 3. I speak often of my identity as a working mom. And so it's one of the things that I can speak most authentically about in this space, where if you say bring your whole self to work and you do not offer flexible work options, you are not inviting, in particular, women to bring them their whole selves to work, just flat out. And that's okay if that's your strategic business decision. We have all the data to show that women, especially in senior leadership roles, are leaving the workforce en masse around this issue. And it's okay if, as a decision, you say, we said that before, we don't actually mean it. Fine. Say it, hold the line. There's some companies that are doing that right now, and then they'll take the consequences. But if you say it, you have to be willing to back it up. And I think that's where the sort of pendulum is swinging back now, because people are holding their organizations to account.
This is a great topic because what we're doing is we're really looking at the real world and trying to adjust a culture to meet it, right? People have their real selves. It's a great idea. Bring your whole self to work. However, it takes a special set of skills that if they're not inherent in a part of the system that makes up the culture, it's going to get messy. It reminds me, I was on the board for a nonprofit when 2020 finally came along. And before 2020 and the pandemic and George Floyd and BLM and defund police, the membership had prided itself on being able to communicate in small teams of men. This was a men's organization. And they could communicate about anything. We have great memories of a Palestinian man and an Israeli man hugging each other in the center of a circle, right? And talking through difficult conversations, but we had strong protocols and practices and skills to do that. But then 2020 hit and it started falling apart at the seams. And all of a sudden it started with our members flaming each other on Facebook about politics, about these hot button issues, right? George Floyd or defund police. And then what happened is some of our members, where in our culture, in this nonprofit, safety was paramount. Without safety, there can be no vulnerability. Without vulnerability, there's no truth, and it all builds on each other. And when men started showing up and saying, hey, I don't feel safe here anymore, we knew we had an issue, a problem. And the problem is that we hadn't implemented the skills and the structure for this new level of people bringing themselves, who were being highly influenced, by the way, by a system of polarization and politics and all the stuff going on out in our society. We just weren't prepared. So we had to build new skills for that. And I think in a similar way, organizations, after saying, bring your whole self to work, now need to implement the skills and the culture to support that. And so that's the next transition.
Being adaptable has been, to me, one of the best skills to come out of the pandemic for HR leaders. To be candid and vulnerable with the HR community, I do think there was a time that we became disjointed from the business. And not all. There were some organizations that I felt way overcorrected into territories that may not be aligned with business objectives. And it's an important symbiotic relationship or balancing act that we have to do between advocating for the business results, but also supporting our team members. The thing that I saw come out in the past probably year and a half, 2 years, has been this concept that is similar to what I was taught as a kid, though I don't know how well it translates into reality, of don't talk about religion or politics at work. That's how I was brought up. That's how I acted in the workplace. But then that started to become policy in some organizations in the past 2 years. What are your all's take on that type of approach to, again, the pendulum swinging back in the opposite direction of no one's personal life should be discussed essentially at work?
I heard a really good quote today. It happened to come from Governor Tim Walz, but I believe it's applicable to both sides of the aisle right now. And that's when someone says, I don't really want to be political. I don't want to get into politics. And he said, politics is going to get into you. And I think the reality of life right now is there is nothing throughout our day when you stop and look at it that hasn't become politicized. And I have a really clear memory of being in the in-person environment back in 2008. It was a run up to the 2008 election. People started to put Obama flags or whatever in their cubicles. And I remember as HR, I literally remember being in my little cubicle, we slid the door, like, what do we do? Do we make a no flag policy, like a no t-shirt? And we decided at that point, at least in that organization, was just let it go, right? I was on a call a couple of weeks ago where we're having the same question. Do we go back to that? Do we say no politics at work, no posters, no paraphernalia, no t-shirts? And I said, the problem right now is so many things have become political, and it really is in the eye of the person who's looking at that to determine. So I have, for example, I have a strong women t-shirt. Someone could say, if I showed up and wore that to work, oh, am I anti-men? No, that may not be it. So what do we say? No slogans on your t-shirt? So I think as HR, we cannot go back to the place where we have these like set of rules of do this and don't do that. I think we have to always lean on use good judgment. And actually, it was on a previous troop discussion where Mita Malik said, I think one of the most important things that really stuck with me is if you wear something like that, or you have a background that says a particular view, just know that you're potentially inviting conversation, and you should be willing to have that conversation. And that's where as HR we can get involved, because we can absolutely set standards for respectful communication. We can and should have standards around what does the Slack guidelines look like? What are the appropriate emojis? P.S. It's not the cat vomit one when someone expresses a view. So some of these tools that we've gotten, they just get out of control because we probably swung a little too far on not policing anything. So I'd like to think about it as HR plays a role in providing guidelines and structure, but coming from a place of having people take responsibility, that if they're going to bring that part of themselves to the workplace, they need to be able to engage in a conversation and do it in a respectful way. And that we will hold them to account for.
Yeah, my answer to this question is probably going to be a little controversial because I'm very clear. Like, we had to make a decision back in 2020. Do we just disallow? Because what they were saying is no more politics, no more of those discussions allowed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And however, in this organization, and I would argue that in every culture, workplace culture as well, in this organization, if our members didn't feel safe and as if they were heard and understood as for who they are, they couldn't participate fully. They couldn't bring them. I mean, the idea of bringing your whole self to work is so that you can be fully engaged, right? Our thinking at the time was, and I still stand behind this, was that if you can't bring a part of yourself into that space, which was our nonprofit at the time, but in any culture, then you are not going to feel safe. You are not going to feel fully heard and understood as a person. And that's going to have an impact down the line. So instead, we chose to build the skill set. And as it turns out, after I ran a set of exercises that unified our organization back in 2020, and I kept having members come to me saying, you should go do this out in the world. And so that's what I'm doing now, is like at a larger scale. But the idea is that I went out and learned about dialogue. I went out and learned about all kinds of conflict resolution and communication and so forth. And as I studied and learned, I realized there are people who can facilitate any type of dialogue between any two sets of people, who can bring them their whole selves to it, as long as they followed protocol, as long as they had a shared common purpose, and as long as they were facilitated and supported in a way that had them succeed. So it's not impossible, but those are the skills that I'm pointing to, that if they're present, can allow for people to realize, oh, I can wear this and we can have a productive conversation. It's just going to look a little different. I'm going to need to be curious about what the other side thinks before I make a judgment about them. I'm going to need to stop with the slogans that aren't really a genuine expression of what I'm thinking and feeling. I'm going to need to share what in my life or experience of life brought me to this place in a way that another person will actually have some curiosity about. And if we can facilitate and support that kind of interaction, I think people can bring their whole selves to work, but it's not going to be out of an echoing of what the system outside of the culture is telling us what to say or telling us what to wear, without us being able to do anything but parrot it. If that's the case, I would suggest don't wear that shirt. But if it's something you believe in, it's an expression of who you are, we have a way to make that work. And the way to do that is to facilitate genuine interaction. The kinds of interaction that leave people more curious about each other instead of judging each other or feeling hurt by another person.
Can I build on that just for 1 second? I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. And I think it makes me think of right away this sort of soundbite culture that we're in. Everything has become a tweet or a text message or a Slack message. And I do think that this is where, practically speaking, I've been in HR for 25 years. So I'm always like, okay, I agree with all of that, but what do I go do? So I think a practical thing that organizations, and particularly HR as change agents, can do is to help to put in some of these, Pete's using the word protocols, practices around communication guidelines. Something is in Slack and it is gone on 3 or 4 times, and it's something that doesn't really require a conversation. Okay, fine. If it can be resolved there, quick information sharing, right? Quick back and forth. But when it starts to turn into something where people are questioning, disagreeing, there has to be a guideline that says that has to get off of that medium. It's like Twitter. There's no conversation, right? So I think when Pete's talking about curiosity, there's no curiosity when you're engaged in short form content. I was just listening. I'm a big podcast listener. Thank you for having us here. And I came in the other morning from my walk and I said it was so refreshing to listen to a long form conversation between people who were challenging each other's views and in a respectful way, as opposed to these sort of short, quick soundbite type of thing. So I guess practically speaking, that is one of the things when I think about the role of HR in terms of like policing or policies. I do think we have a place when it comes to communication guidelines and expectations about what tools are meant for what, and then hold people to account for using them that way.
It's something you said, or the way that you framed it, I felt is really important. Each organization should determine what works best for them and their culture. In an episode that we have previously recorded, we talked about with the guest, the concept is there's not a one size fits all solution here. I do think what both of you have demonstrated in your answers is you need to really be in tune to what is going to work in your culture and keep people focused on, yes, having polite discourse between each other, but also getting the work done. So when you have or you've worked with executives, whether it be an ERG or a certain initiative that has led to some type of controversial event, and an executive comes to you and says, we just got to end that. It's a distraction for the business. It's pulling away from the business. How do you handle that conversation? What are some of the framing or tools you would encourage our listeners to do when approached with these types? Because these types of conversations are coming up more and more right now.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is hopefully things don't have to get to an executive. And I think that part of what happens is we have to ensure that our leadership gets out of their echo chamber and has a finger on the pulse of the business so they know what actually is going on. I think one of the double-edged swords of a lot of people in leadership is they have a sense of humility. They see themselves as one of the people, especially if they work their way up in an organization. They want to hang, they feel like they know what the people, and they forget that once they get that title, they have a positional power that right away limits people from sharing a certain amount of information. So they may feel like, oh yeah, I got lunch with the people, I'm at the town hall, whatever, I know what's going on. But they have to acknowledge that they're not getting the whole story. A lot of it comes back to the psychological safety that Pete's talking about. So I think that's the first thing, is making sure that you break down those barriers and acknowledge that. So having the feelers out to actually have a pulse on the organization, not just that little closed group of people that are probably just going to keep telling you what you're going to hear. And then I guess more directly to your question, when that does happen, I've had particular personal experience with that. That's where the rubber meets the road with your leadership style. That's where everything you've said to that point about the open door policy and I care about the people, that's the moment that matters right there. How do you react? Do you outsource it? Do you say, oh, here's the coach, the consultant, the investigator, the mediator, go ahead, go fix it? Or are you willing to get down in the weeds and have the hard conversations? And furthermore, look at what role did you play in fostering or allowing this particular issue to manifest, and a lot of times sort of fester beneath the surface. So I guess that's the way I'd look at it, is proactive, which I know Pete's going to have a lot to say about. It's one of sort of the cornerstones of the work that he's doing right now, is all about the proactive communication. And the reality is, once it does blow up, that's not your chance. That just says everything about your leadership style, is how you handle it from that point.
Yes. And HR has a big responsibility. It's a tough spot, right? Being between leadership is what I'm hearing you describe this as. You're between a rock and a hard place. You're between leadership and our culture, our society. And people have real lives that they're bringing to work, and they're impacted by media and X and politics and all the other stuff. And I think where that's ending up, and I think we know it's ending up on HR's shoulders. And so what's HR going to do about it? If I have any say about it, they're going to minimize the distractions to leadership, right? They're going to minimize and shield leadership and figure out how to proactively and effectively manage the culture when it comes to conflict. And the way to do that is through new skills, early detection, proactive work. But I think the real question is, how can I minimize those distractions to leadership so I don't have to deal with them putting down their foot and saying enough, right? Because if they do that, which is understandable, it will impact the culture, right? People won't feel safe. They won't feel like they belong. And we can say belonging all you want, but until people feel like they really belong, it's not real, right? You've got to be able to bring your whole self. So again, I think the question is, how can HR minimize the distractions, insulate leadership from all that messy stuff, and handle it effectively?
What's resonated so much with me in both your all's answers is when I was a firefighter, we would always talk about the worst time to discuss fire prevention is when your house is on fire. It's the proactive work. It's making sure your smoke detectors work in advance so people are safe, not having unsustainable or dangerous things you're doing in the home. All of these are what resonates so much with me when you're talking about the prevention of these things. The other really elegant point is by the time it gets to an executive, that's when you start to deal with ultimatums, because executives are used to just, now I'm going to make a call. And that's really tough to navigate. And Pete, you mentioned between being a rock and a hard spot. I feel like that's generally where HR lives, anyways, but certainly not a situation that we want to be in. The other evolution that I've noticed over the past few years, and again, this is from my own view, so I welcome dissent, is the subjective definition of safety. I've heard from colleagues that they're getting more and more complaints that someone feels unsafe, but their subjective feeling of feeling unsafe is because someone disagrees with them on an issue. Or, Jen, you'd mentioned wearing some type of shirt that makes a statement. Then there's dissent with that statement, oftentimes a completely different view, and now that individual feels unsafe. So when an HR leader gets these types of cases that come in where someone raises that particular type of safety issue, what recommendations do you have for them to investigate and explore? Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, it's perfect because I ran an exercise called Common Ground exercise in that nonprofit. And at the top of the exercise, I'm standing there in a circle of 60 men at an offsite. And the first thing I said is, look, I've heard a lot of you say you don't feel safe anymore in our circles. And that's okay. And safety is an experience that you may have, but it's not one that I can tell you what it is. You will have to experience whether you're safe or not. But what we can create here today, I'm not going to promise to create a safe space, but we can create, and I want to give some call out and thanks and acknowledgement to Brene Brown, we can create as a brave space. And a brave space is one where we might get a little uncomfortable. If you can think of a circle and the circle is the safe space, right? Just a little bit beyond that might be a little bit of discomfort, right? We're not going to go way out there to the unsafe space where it's just like very uncomfortable, but it might get a little uncomfortable. It might be just outside of your boundary for what is comfortable. And so I don't know if inside that circle is safe or comfort, but they're analogous to people sometimes. And I just want to create a culture where we're okay getting a little uncomfortable. We can acknowledge that and then see what there is to do about it and not shy away from it and use heavy words like I'm not safe, because that tends to shut down the conversation. And so if we can just work a little bit more on a brave space that we can collectively create, we're both going to be a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. And with some good skills and protocols and so forth, we can work through this.
I guess what it brings to mind, you said it earlier, Taylor, was that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And right away, I think about, again, as a parent with 3 kids, where one of them feels safe in the dark basement with no lights, having a sleepover with their friends, and the other one can't go upstairs to brush their teeth unless someone's right next to them, I'll be honest, makes me crazy. Because as if I see myself as the beholder of how they should experience safety, I'm going to lose my mind. And I do. Go brush your dang teeth. You're safe. It's your house. I don't need to be next to you. But who am I to say that? And I know that every single time I lead that way, I do think that all leadership lessons, if you're a caregiver, come through that role in a very real way. Who am I to say that? Because that's my view of what's right and wrong. And in a lot of ways, it's often what's easiest or most comfortable for me. I don't want to deal with your lack of safety. So I agree with the brave space idea as an organizational sort of like construct and goal, and something to, because you can't have individualized policies and programs. You can't do that in an organization beyond one. So there's a reality of that. And I think the onus is on us as managers, as leaders, as HR professionals to constantly be taking the individual approach. I probably say on LinkedIn at least once a week, just because it's not a problem for you does not mean it's not a problem for someone else. And I say it over and over again. And I think that when we can keep reminding ourselves that way, that someone saying, I don't feel safe, that's a strong thing. And the minute we say, oh, there's that 2020 catchphrase that gets them out of taking responsibility, we're closing the door to what we can discover about that person's real lived experience and completely shutting down, recognizing that their lived experience might be entirely different from our own, and we might not have any idea what it is. So brave space, yes. Getting people outside their comfort zone, and also recognizing that we have no idea what people are bringing or not bringing or hiding that would have them have a different experience of safety than we perhaps may ever understand.
I want to tack on to that. This leads right into this whole other idea of a jungle tiger. A great podcaster, his name is, I think it's Trevor Reagan. I was listening to this and I was like, oh man, this makes so much sense. And what he talks about is this idea of what I think of, why would you even want to get uncomfortable? Why would you want a brave space? Why would you be willing to feel a little unsafe? And the answer, he talks about this idea of a jungle tiger, where they've done experiments and they've compared the brains of a jungle tiger versus a zoo tiger. And a zoo tiger's brain is actually much smaller. A jungle tiger has to wake up every morning looking for food, not knowing what's going to happen, protecting my young, figuring out life and survival. And a zoo tiger is basically spoon-fed every day and everything's safe and they have this small area. They don't have to figure anything out. And it's this expansion, this development of the brain of a jungle tiger is what I would like to see more cultures develop in the intelligence of the culture and its participants. It's this ability to get uncomfortable that's going to actually build the skills you need. And if you shy away from getting uncomfortable, if you stay in the safe space, you'll never have the skills or the ability to handle what's beyond that. So this idea of a jungle tiger is really powerful. Do you want to be a jungle tiger or do you want to be a zoo tiger? If you want to be a zoo tiger, stop everything at where you're safe. Anything beyond that's not okay. And if you allow that as a culture, my opinion is you're not going to ever be able to deal with the difficult stuff. And we have no idea what's coming. Like the election's coming up, right? There's all kinds of things coming up. There's wars, there's international stuff, there's the Israeli conflict, there's all kinds of stuff that haven't even happened yet. I'm a big proponent of having these cultures expand their ability to handle what's really going on and what people really want to bring to work, which is their whole selves, because we can do it. We just need to move through the discomfort and be jungle tigers about it.
And that's a segue to my second to last question, as we come in for a landing, of course, is we've talked a lot about heavy stuff. And similar to what you just described, Pete, is, and I'll kick it over to Jen first. What optimistic advice would you give to the individual that feels like there's a lot going on right now? I think part of that is just life always has things going on. But when it comes to communicating and work and interacting with colleagues, Jen, what is some optimistic, positive advice that you'd give to folks?
You caught me on a good day. I was just disclosing that this morning I found myself moving from like anger and disbelief about the political environment to sadness, really. I was on my morning walk and talking to my sister and just crying, just sadness. So I guess my optimistic, though it's not going to sound that way, my optimistic advice is to allow yourself and know that everything you're feeling is okay and it's normal. I think we have this small range of emotions that are allowed at work, but even with ourselves, that we allow ourselves to sit with and experience, right? So I think know that all of it is normal. And I guess the second thing is when you're feeling overwhelmed, don't even say if, when you're feeling overwhelmed, is take that sphere of focus, which at the outer limits is like global, and bring that down as small as you possibly can. It might not even be like your family today. certainly might not be your workplace. It might be like just yourself. And you got to sometimes put the blinders on. I heard a really great phrase that I come back to a lot right now around media consumption. I struggle with this a lot because I remember early in the pandemic, I was obsessed. It was a lot, most of us were, right, with watching the news. And it took me to a really dark place, and I had to go cold turkey. And I've since gone up and down. And I heard this line that said, the amount you consume does not correlate to the amount you care. Because my internal struggle has been the inherent privilege that it is for me to go, I don't want to watch that today. I don't want to read that today. It doesn't make me feel good. That's privilege, because that's not the reality for people who are actually living some of these really horrific things. And I can care and also care for myself. So I guess that's the other thing I would say in terms of like optimistic. Allow yourself to experience it all, but go back to the things that are actually within your direct sphere of control. And it just might be like, what do you have for lunch, or go out for a quick walk, or hug your kid tonight. Something easy that brings you joy.
My nugget of optimism is, and I think it brings me peace of mind when I think about it, is there's some studies, and this is specific to politics and the time that we're in right now. We're coming up to an election. But what I would like people to know and really let in is that we're really, truly not as polarized and separated and divided as the system, as the media and the politicians would like to have us believe. The fact is, there's been studies. I think there's one at the University of Michigan. I believe there's several of these studies that came out recently that showed that while, and I'm going to use political affiliations, while let's say 85% of Republicans think 85%, I'm using rough numbers, they're not accurate, but let's say they believe 85 or 90% of Democrats want to defund police and don't care about rule and order or something like that around an issue. When the truth is, for that specific fear that they have, it's more like 7 or 10% of Democrats. And the Democrats, most Democrats, let's say 90% of Democrats, think most Republicans don't care about democracy or don't care about individual rights or women's rights or whatever it is. When the truth is, it's a much, much smaller amount of those Republicans. There's a lot of people that are in the gray area. And yet we live as if we know, and we're put into this state of fear because of that, because it's, wow, they're all believing this, and it just freaks each other out. So what I feel like would be my good news is that we're not as far apart as you would think. And I experienced this when we did the common ground exercise. Once we stopped talking about the external issues and began speaking about the common ground, the values deep inside of us that we share with each other, we saw how much common ground we really did have. And it was a foundation on which to have wonderful conversations, even about those other issues. But it takes that kind of connection first. So there's a lot of reason to have hope about that. We're really not as divided as we think.
To quote Princess Leia from Star Wars, hope, right? I think that's one of the most compelling traits within society that still exist. In a prior episode with the Huerta brothers, I also talked about when I was a firefighter and showed up to a car accident or a car fire, a house fire. It never surprised me how immediately other people in society that don't know each other at all, don't ask, are you a Republican, are you a Democrat, Jim, before I help you? They all pitched in and helped. That was the immediate human reaction, was to help someone in need. And that's what gives me significant amount of hope. Pete, what you touched on too is important. These media outlets are companies. They get revenue through clicks. They get clicks through often having really emotional things. And something that I've always said is a great superpower of media companies, of politicians, is they get you to worry a little bit about everything so that you care deeply about nothing. And so my advice to folks is figure out what you care deeply about. What's great is, Pete, it shows with you when you're nonprofit, this is an area you care deeply about, you commit to. That's how you make a difference in the world. And so I'd encourage listeners to keep up that hope, keep fighting for what they believe in and deeply, And then, of course, finding that common ground that you both have so eloquently spoke about. Final question, and this should be probably the easiest one of the day, is if our listeners want to get in contact with you all, what is the best route to do that? Jen, we'll start with you, and then Pete will have you close this out.
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you can find me. My handle is FoxGen.
Yeah, same here. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm at Pete Turok, and that's Turok. I just want to really leave with that. Remember, everyone, especially in HR, right? Conflict in and of itself isn't scary. It's mismanaged conflict that's very scary. So you can do this. You can do this.
Said, Pete, Jen, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit TroopHR.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.